morning. Hopefully my voice will hold out and we'll be able to get through this lesson. I've put a lot of people to sleep over the years while preaching. Today might be the first day I do myself, so we are definitely tired today, but our hearts are full and we're excited to be back with you. Y'all are our family, and we love being with our family for worship. I'm actually going to preach for you today the lesson that I preached on Sunday night during camp, because I think it has some good application for all ages. So sorry for the repeat for a few of y'all from during camp, but I think there's some good application here for all of us. We struggle in this world, I think, sometimes to find a very sure path. We talked about Noah this morning in our Bible classes, and I think that's probably what most of us talked about. And we talked about what a man of exemplary character he must have been to stay not only strong in his relationship with God in the midst of an environment where it describes the human race as those whose every intention of their heart was on evil. It's very hard to be faithful in that kind of environment. Very hard to be faithful whenever the world around you is entirely against you, and the world around you is trying to sway you a different direction, and the world around you is trying to tell you that you're wrong. It's hard to hold firm to the truth. Noah not only held firm to the truth, but he was described in 2 Peter chapter 2 as a preacher of righteousness. He went out in a world that was known for violence and talked about God. The only reason Noah was able to do that is because he was himself thoroughly convinced in his path. He was himself absolutely sure that going out there and doing what God had asked him to do was the right thing to do. And there's some debate as to whether there had ever been rain before on earth before that point or not. But Noah, knowing that God was going to send a flood, whether he understood what that was, I think we're probably pretty sure that he did not understand the extent of that flood. He still did it, because his path so focused on doing the things of God and pursuing the way of God that he had a determination and sureness to his path. He knew exactly what he needed to do and why he needed to do it, because he was following a God that was giving him direction. And that's what I want to talk about today, is how do we, in our world that is full of wickedness, follow God and be sure about the direction that God is sending us? Because I think that's an important thing for us to wrestle with. See, here's what the world tells us. A famous poem written by Robert Frost. The very end of the poem says, "Two roads diverged in the woods, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference." And the idea behind this poem is that you should travel the less traveled road. You should go the way less people are going. If the majority is going right, you go left, because that is where the adventure is. That's the right road to take. The problem with that logic is that you're still letting the world determine which direction you should go, because you're just doing what they're not doing. And that does not necessarily lead you in the right direction. Another statement that the world might share is, life is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. Follow the path that is no path. Follow your bliss. Again, the idea is, do what makes you happy. It doesn't matter what path it is. It doesn't even have to be a path. You just do what brings you your bliss. You do what makes you happy. But again, I think probably most of us in this room have enough maturity and experience to realize the fault in that logic. What makes me happy might not be what makes my children happy. Does that mean they're supposed to rebel against me and do what makes them happy? while I do what makes me happy, and we have different families in here that are directed by elders, but nobody's actually listening to the counsel of the elders because they're just going to do what makes them happy. That leads to chaos. It does not lead to any clear path. Arthur Clarke says you got to go down a lot of wrong roads to find the right one. Again, we see through that, I hope. Does that mean that as long as I make enough mistakes, then I can be sure that I will find the right path and know what that path is? No. See, the two problems with this is that what if you just continue to make mistakes? What if there's never a right path that appears because there are thousands of wrong paths that you have to go down first? And then even if you find the right path, after you've made so many mistakes along the way, how are you to really know that the right path is the right path if it just feels like one of the rest of them? There's so many difficulties we run into with the world's logic on how you're supposed to know who you are and what you're supposed to do. Here's another one I found. Our journey as human beings is not about following a preordained path, but about creating that path. Life rarely makes any more sense when things are done in order. Life makes sense when we are centered in our hearts and we let go of resisting how our unique journey needs to unfold in its own beautifully unruly way. You know, that sounds fun and adventurous, but it actually says nothing. I mean, that statement gives no direction whatsoever. It says there is no path. You create your own path, but the way you create your own path is by not following any path. As long as you're centered, your heart, you'll just let go of everything, and that will in itself create a non-path for you to not follow. What? How in the world is this any direction whatsoever for any of us? But that's the kind of advice the world gives. The old expression, don't take hair advice from a bald man. That's kind of what we're running into here. Is that we got a whole world of people that are confused and lost and unsure of any right way and been taught that there is no right way, but we feel deep down in our heart that there is a right way, and so we're trying to find a right way among the idea that there is no right way, therefore you just create your own way. And that your own way might be different than someone else's own way, and your right might be different than someone else's right, and therefore your path is uniquely yours and their path is uniquely theirs, but somehow those paths will align even though we're not even sure there's a path anyway. It's a mess trying to follow the world's way of doing things. And the reason that is because all of these paths that we're talking about, like a self-focused path where it's all about doing what is good for you, is not going to help you. If you only do what's good for you, then you betray everybody else around you. You know, if I do what's good for me and I wake up in the morning and I don't feel good, I just stay home. I go grab a snack out of the pantry, I turn on a movie, and I sit there and watch the movie. And then the next day I feel like I'm sore from the laying in bed before, so now I'm not going to go into work because I don't feel good. Again, just in a different way. But then I get bored, and so then I'm going to go out and do what I want to do. Maybe I'll go out and I'll play a round of golf. I don't golf, but if I did, I'd go out and play a round of golf. But then I realized I kind of twisted my knee and my back hurts a little bit, so the next day I don't go to work again because I still don't feel good, and I'm focusing on myself for right now. Do you see how this turns into a mess? Eventually I show up for work and my boss says, why are you here? Well, I'm here to work. Well, we sent you a note that says you're terminated. Well, I don't agree with that, so I'm going to work anyway. You still have to pay me. It doesn't work that way. You cannot solely focus on yourself and expect that life is going to work out for you. A self-centered path where it's all about the service of you leaves everyone and every responsibility betrayed. A self-pleasing path is the same way. If it's all about finding your bliss, I'm sorry to tell you, part of growing up is learning how to do things you don't like. Part of growing up. Much of the advice that the world gives is advice you might give a 3-year-old. Yet we're giving it to 30-year-olds and trying to figure out where things went wrong. Part of the wrong path is a self-glorifying path. It's all about attention. It's all about me getting accolades. It's all about compliments. It's all about me being made to feel good. It's all about the world dancing around me. And I'm sorry to tell you, but that is not a realistic world. Even the most popular, the most successful people have the people who don't like them. And if all you do is live for the glory of others, you're going to find yourself deeply disappointed. Truth is, most of the paths that the world will tell you to follow are selfish paths. That's just the easy way to sum it up. And I'm going to tell you right now, most all of sin can be traced back to selfishness, which is why the selfish path won't work. Turn with me over to Psalm 78. I was tempted to read the whole thing, mostly because I'm tired and it would eat up about 10 minutes of the sermon, because it's a real long psalm here. 60-something verses, I think. No, 72 verses. It's long. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I would encourage you to read the whole thing. It is a summary of Israel's history up to the time of David. And it is a well-told summary. It talks about all these stories from Israel's past and the way that they have betrayed God because of the things that they pursued, which really sum up to the very list you just saw on the screen, the selfish path. The children of Israel constantly chose themselves over God, themselves over their brethren, themselves over the law, themselves over God's promises, and themselves over the world. And it led to disaster after disaster in their lives. You know, God leads them through the wilderness, as we know, that God rescues them out of Egypt. He brings them to their promised land. They betray God, decide they're not going to trust in him. God takes them through the wilderness. God leading them with a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, yet they still become lost. They still can't follow God, even though God walks before them day after day. He brings them to their land. He brings them across the Jordan River. They walk into their land. They're able to victoriously fight against all of the cities there with a few little hiccups here and there. But as a whole, God walks before them and conquers their land, right? So now they're going to be faithful to God no matter what. God gave them victory. Nope. They still stray away from God. Doesn't matter how much God walks before them and how obvious God is, they still walk away. God has to rescue them repeatedly in the story of Judges. Now that they've conquered their land, they're there, they're established, they're a people, yet they keep betraying God, and God allows an oppressor to come in and oppress them for a while, and they cry out for rescue, and God sends them a rescuer. And then they walk away from God again. They betray God over and over and over again through the book of Judges, right? And what is the statement that's often made in the book of Judges? Every man did what was right in his own eyes. Selfish path. The selfish path. Do you not see that? They choose to go their own way. They do what's right in their eyes, not what's right in God's eyes. They give him a king. God gives them a king. They ask for a king. God says, okay. God chooses Saul. Saul chooses his own path, leads the people astray. God chooses David. David does great. Does pretty good. Solomon, a disaster. Now, Solomon, I never noticed this until this last week when we were studying through one of our classes on Solomon. I always pictured Solomon as being that guy who came in and he did pretty good for a few years and then he walked away from God as soon as he started marrying all these women. That's not what it actually says. What it says is when he was old, he walked away from God. When he's old, he walks away. I mean, here, God gave him every opportunity. God gave Solomon every chance to be faithful and right. And yet, even when he's old, he decides to walk away from God. He becomes clueless. Even though he is the wisest man who ever lived, he's clueless because he pursues the selfish path. Psalm 78 tells that story to us of the struggle of a people who are continually walking away from God and betraying God. And I'm just going to point out several verses from the Psalm for you, and I hope you'll go back and read it this afternoon before or after your nap. They would not be like their ancestors, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation whose heart was not loyal and whose spirit was not faithful to God. They turned back on the day of battle because they forgot the wondrous works of God. They continued to sin against him. They deliberately tested God. Despite all of this, talking about the things God had done for them, they kept sinning. It says they deceived him with their mouth. They lied to him with their tongues. Their hearts were insincere toward God, and they were unfaithful to their covenant. How often they rebelled against him in the wilderness. Do you see a pattern? See a pattern being set up here? Over and over and over again. This chapter, this psalm, shows us that these people did not pursue the way of God. And it happens for one reason. You see it there at the beginning of the psalm. Read with me here the first few verses of Psalm 78. My people, hear my instructions. Listen to the words from my mouth. I will declare wise sayings. I will speak mysteries from the past, things we have known and heard, and that our fathers have passed down to us. We will not hide them from our children, but will tell a future generation the praiseworthy acts of the Lord, his might, and his wondrous works he has performed. He established a testimony in Jacob and set up a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers to teach their children, so that a future generation, children yet to be born, might know. They were to rise and tell their children, so that they might put their confidence in God and not forget God's works, but keep his commandments. The reason all of this rebellion happened is because they took their attention away from the God they were supposed to be serving. That's why. They did that really in two ways. One is they did not remember the works of their faithful and generous God. Mentions that there in verse 1 through 4. And then they didn't trust that his way is the right way. But that's really one and the same. If you believe that God is faithful and generous and a provider and a sustainer and a God who wants what is good for us, then we will believe that his way is the right way. They go hand in hand. But when you take your attention off of the God who is the provider and the sustainer and the giver of all good things, then you will not trust in his way. Then you pursue your own way. Brothers and sisters, I'm convinced that this is still the very same internal battle we fight today. I think this is a struggle that we in the church have because we have failed to remember the goodness and the faithfulness of God. You know why we failed to remember that? Because we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it. When's the last time? I'll speak to some of our older of the older generation here for a moment. How much time have you spent sharing with the young people all of the ways you've seen God provide and you've seen God's providence in your life? Because how much of that is a 17-year-old going to know? 17-year-old has watched mom and dad provide, but I don't know that they've had the same experience of God's providence that you have at 60 years old. That 17-year-old needs to be told. That 17-year-old needs to be reminded constantly. And did you notice here in these first several verses how often it talked about the next generation hearing these things? Did you notice that twice in here? Verse 3, that our fathers have passed down to us. And then you look down in verse 6 and 7, so that a future generation, children yet to be born, might know. They were to rise and tell their children, so that they might put their confidence in God and not forget God's works. You want to know why in the New Testament it makes a big deal? Paul makes a big deal to Timothy that the older generation needs to teach the younger generation, that older women need to teach the younger women to love their husband and to keep their home and to make sure that they're talking to the younger generation. And why older men are to teach the younger men the things of God, it's because it's the only way the younger generation will know God well enough to trust that God's way is the right way. It's the only way it works. We wonder why our young people are walking away from their faith. It's because our older people aren't talking enough about their faith. And younger people, you need to learn to keep your mouth shut and listen. You need to learn to seek out those stories, to seek out the experience of the older generation, whether you think they're hip or rad or groovy. I know, I just threw those words out just to throw everyone off. I mean, whether you think they're cool or not, they have stories you need to hear. They have stories you've not heard. They have experiences you need to learn. They can tell you about how God brought them through what was sure financial ruin. They didn't know where the next grocery money was going to come from, but somehow it showed up because God provides, so that when you have those months coming in your future, you'll learn to trust God too. And they can tell you about what to do and not to do when it comes to raising children. And they can tell you about their mistakes and how they've repented from them and that God has blessed them because of it. Older people need to start using their mouths a little more, and younger people need to start using their ears a little more. Because it is the only way generational faithfulness works. But somehow the devil has convinced our older generation that young people don't want to hear, and our younger generation that older people don't have anything to say. And then our young people are walking away and everybody's shrugging their shoulders going, we don't understand. God told us the answer. We just have to believe that God's way is the right way. There are a lot of passages that repeat that idea. Passages we're familiar with. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not rely on your own understanding. In all your ways, know Him, and He will make your path straight. Do you see that idea of knowledge of Him puts us on the right path? Knowledge of Him tells us, gives us the assurance and the confidence that God's way is right, and gives us a reason to follow His way instead of our own. A person's heart plans his way, but the Lord determines his steps. Again, this idea of, we think we know the right thing, but we don't. God knows the right way. We have to trust that God's way is right. It's the only sure path there is. Over in Isaiah 48, verse 17, this is what the Lord, the Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel says, I am the Lord your God who teaches you for your benefit, who leads you in the way that you should go. If only you had paid attention to my command, then your peace would have been like a river and your righteousness like the waves of the sea. Where is righteousness and peace found? In God's way. It's always in God's way. Proverbs 19, verse 20, listen to counsel and receive instruction so that you may be wise later in life. You hear that, young people? Listen. Many plans are in a person's heart, but the Lord's decree will prevail. Isaiah 30, verse 20, end of verse 20 and verse 21. Your eyes will see your teacher. And whenever you turn to the right or to the left, your ears will hear this command behind you. This is the way, walk in it. That was our theme verse for camp this year. Not because of the Mandalorian reference in there. That's not the reason. But I'll say this. Have you ever noticed that God went from being in front of the people to here Isaiah describes him as being behind us? When you're in front of people, you have to trust that the people are going to follow. And did they? No. The description that Isaiah gives us here of God is not him being a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Not him walking as a soldier, as a general in front of us, leading his army into battle. Here he's described as the counselor and the friend who stands behind us. And he's right behind us whispering, this is the way. Go. Walk in it. Don't turn away from this. No, don't go over there. Turn back to the right way. Follow the right path. Stay on the straight and narrow. That's the kind of God we have. God cares that we are on the right path. He determines what that is, and then he motivates us and cheers us on as we go along the way. And I hope we'll let him. I hope we'll let him. Part of that is by listening to the people who trust in God's way, people who have walked the path in front of us. But then part of it is listening to the voice of God behind us that is urging us forward and prodding us forward and trying to get us to move in the right direction. That is truly the only sure path. The one that God is encouraging us to be on. I don't know if you're on that path. Many of us have been baptized, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're on the right path. Of the baptisms that happened last week, several of them were rebaptisms. Put that in quotes because there's no real such thing. You're baptized. They decided that their first time was just getting wet. And the second time was the right thing. That might be you. You might be one who has struggled and wondered and questioned whether what you did back years ago was truly making that determined proclamation or confession that you truly were going to let God be in control. If that's the case, let's talk. Let's make sure. Let's make sure that you are on the path that God has set before you. For some of us, we've never been baptized at all. Today's a good day to do that. It honestly doesn't take. I would imagine, I don't know how quick of a teacher Paul was. I don't know what their songs were that Paul and Silas sang in jail, but that jailer, when he determined that he was lost, was baptized the same hour of the night. I doubt he had a degree in theological studies or knew Hebrew and had read through the Old Testament scriptures. I would imagine he knew he was a sinner, he was lost, and the only way to be found was to turn to Jesus. I would imagine that pretty much sums up what he knew. And I'll tell you right now, if you know that, and you've not been baptized, be baptized today. That's enough. Some of us might just be struggling. We know there is a sure path. We know our feet aren't on it. And we just need prayers. But all of us have a chance at rescue right now. All of us have a chance of getting our feet back in the right place right now. And if we can help you do that, come forward and let us know how as we stand and sing.
Who followed Jesus standing for the right.